Hello, I'm Gerry Egan. Thank you for tuning into this distance learning program from the National Association of Equipment Leasing Brokers. How would you like to be more valuable to your vendors? Or maybe the question should be, how could you be more valuable to them? If you could be, if you were more valuable to them, doesn't it make sense that they then, by definition, would be more valuable to you? If that does make sense to you, and if you really want to give more value to your vendors and get more value from them in return, then I'm going to suggest two things. First, it's not only possible, it's probably easier than whatever you're doing right now. And second, it doesn't require any new funding sources, any special pricing or custom programs. It simply requires a shift in how you view your vendors and your job. In this program, I'm going to tell you some things you can do that can dramatically increase the value you give to and get from your vendors while making your job easier, more productive, and more enjoyable. I'm going to start by talking about strategy and effectiveness for a minute and about the typical objections or problems or complaints that I hear brokers talking about regarding their vendors. I'll also be talking about the trouble with the traditional, most common vendor strategies, and you'll see why those strategies themselves give rise to those very objections and problems. Way too many brokers say they have a vendor strategy when what they really have is a generalized goal or target of generating a certain number of applications from them. Now, of course, having a goal is important, but it's important that goal be something that serves your business interests, and then the strategy should flow from that. For me, in my business, it's never been an objective or goal of mine to see how many applications I can generate. Applications themselves don't serve my business interest. I've yet to find the underwriter who will pay me for applications. The only ones I know pay for booked leases. Booking leases is the way I make money, and so my vendor strategy is built around that. Now, having a goal is all well and good, but my vendor strategy is unlikely to help me in any meaningful way to reach that goal unless I have specific things I'll do, specific tactics I'll use that are effective and that also serve the needs of my business. If any part of what I'm doing isn't focused exclusively on bookable leases, then I'm actually working against myself. It doesn't matter if I say I have a strategy or not. That's why brokers who focus too much on generating applications can easily find themselves way busier but way less successful than they wanted to be. It's described in the difference between efficiency and effectiveness. Efficiency is doing things better. Effectiveness is doing the right things. The classic example is a car speeding toward a cliff. The last thing that car needs is more efficiency, more horsepower. That car needs to be doing something else entirely. When I look at it that way, it becomes easy for me to see that as a measure of success, it doesn't matter how many applications I'm generating, but how few applications I have to generate in order to book a lease. So it's not enough to say you have a vendor strategy unless you have specific tactics or methods or things you can do that will let you reach your goal of booked leases most effectively. If that doesn't describe you today, if your business is not as effective as you'd like it to be, or as you believe it could be, if you feel your vendor strategy is making you work harder than you should have to work for the results you're getting, the good news is you can change that. But that's the bad news too, because it means you may have to change what you're doing and how you look at it. Doing that takes an open mind and a willingness to do different things rather than trying to solve everything by just doing more and more of the same old things. Maybe these guys need to learn that lesson. Now, that's a cute cartoon, and it makes for a nice chuckle. But it also portrays the problem many brokers have in working with their vendors. They're trying to make progress through sheer brute force. Lower rates, faster turnaround, paying points, or whatever, rather than putting that vendor relationship to work for them in a more effective way. And you just know these are the same guys who are constantly complaining about their vendors too. Oh, they're not loyal enough, or they're too demanding, or yada, yada, yada. But we have to remember this. When the dart fails to hit the dartboard, it's rarely the dartboard's fault. So if you've ever heard this, if you'll just take this deal, of course it's a poor creditor startup, we can do some business, then I'll bring you my good ones. Or, I'm in a competitive business and time counts. I send all my applications to 2 or 3 sources, and the first one back with an approval gets the deal. Or any leasing company can do my A and B credits. If you want to show me good service, you've got to be willing to write my C and D credits too. Or another company can give me a lower rate, and I've got to look out for my customer. And I've got to have the lowest rates. Otherwise, I'm just adding to my price, and that makes me less competitive. And this one, I like your service, but I sold my customer on a certain payment. If I can get a lower rate factor, I'll make more money. And of course, they give me 2.5 points. If you can beat that, I'll bring you all my business. If any of these do sound familiar, I can promise you a couple of things. First, they all stem from the same root cause, and if you address that, you can say goodbye to each and every one of them. Second, the traditional vendor strategies as practiced in our industry will not only not address them, they actually create those objections. Most traditional vendor strategies fall into one of 2 categories. We'll call them leasing to close and sales kit catch-all. The first one is based on using leasing to close a sale that the vendor salesperson otherwise couldn't get closed. Its underlying assumption is that the money is always the issue, and it's designed to provide the all-American solution of easy monthly payments. The problem with that, as we'll see, is that it's focused on the wrong thing at the wrong time. For us, as equipment leasing salespeople, that strategy ignores our one big strength and focuses the vendor, and by extension the customer, on our one big weakness. The second one is based on the assumption that if we could assemble the perfect sales kit with just the right rates, those ideal terms, the most agreeable credit standards, the right amount of points or whatever, if we could pack that kit with enough choices and programs to cover everything for everybody, all our sales problems would disappear. In fact, though, it tends to do the opposite. The more we customize our programs in response to easily anticipated objections, which could be dealt with more effectively in other ways, the more we validate those objections in the minds of our vendors, and the more focused we keep on them. All these kinds of programs, in either of the 2 standard marketing models, have the same goal, and they have the same weakness. What's that goal? The goal is to get the vendor to call us with a lead. What's the weakness? The weakness is getting the vendor to call us with a lead. Why is that a weakness? Because someone else is defining for you what a good prospect is, and they own that prospect, not you. Let's take a look. Your problems with vendors all stem from one thing: asking them for a lead. That's fraught with problems because then you're working on their lead, and I'm going to suggest to you further that they don't even know what a good leasing lead is. In fact, for every vendor lead you get called in, I can tell you 3 things with absolute certainty right now. The customer didn't pay cash, you're now selling sales finance, and you're expected to cut to close. Let's take a look at each one and see how it undermines your own interests. First, the customer didn't pay cash. Well, duh! Can you imagine a vendor turning down cash? I'm not sure I'd even want to work with a vendor foolish enough to turn down cash. But what's important about it is, why didn't the customer pay cash? When we think about it, there are only 3 reasons why not. One is he doesn't want it. He's not sold. He doesn't want whatever it is the vendor's selling. The vendor, though, is hoping beyond hope that your lease quote will somehow magically overcome that and make him want it, make him sold. That's just plain unlikely. Another is the customer wants it but can't afford it. Now granted, there are some folks you may be able to help out in that case by getting them some form of financing, but my personal experience is that it's a lot easier to get credit approval for people who can easily afford to buy what they want than for people who can't afford to. The last reason a customer didn't pay cash is that the customer wants it and the customer can afford it, and the customer is a shrewd financial manager who wants to look at all the options available before making the decision of how to acquire it. Now that's my definition of a good prospect. I'd stand an excellent chance of selling that customer a lease and of getting it approved and booked. But every time a vendor calls you with a lead, the first thing you can know for sure is the customer didn't pay cash, and of the reasons why not, 2 out of the 3 don't, frankly, bode well or make it easy for you as an equipment leasing salesperson. Now, the second thing I can tell you about every lead a vendor calls you with is that you're now selling sales finance. The customer has been presented with a purchase price, for one reason or another, has declined to pay it, and you're now quoting payments on that purchase price. So all of the focus is now on that purchase price and how much you're adding to it. That's rate, rate, rate. Am I wrong? How do you evaluate financing for things you consider buying? The problem is that all of the wonderfully differentiating benefits we have available to offer as equipment leasing salespeople are basically out of the picture at this point. If you can sell leasing at this point, it's going to be a hard, uphill battle, if it's even possible at all. The third thing I can tell you about every lead a vendor calls in is that it's up to you to cut to close. In other words, if someone has to cut their profit in order to make the deal happen, more times than not, it'll be you. Why? It's simple. It's the vendor's prospect, and you've been invited in. To the vendor, whatever you get is a handout from him to you. And when the deal is close, he's looking for someone else to take the hit in order to make the numbers work for him. All of this is because you're asking the vendor for leasing leads. What's the answer? Don't do it. I'm listed in a number of directories as a vendor and get calls on a weekly basis from leasing brokers from around the country asking if I have any leasing prospects they can work on. Now think about that. Isn't that almost insulting? If I had a lead, am I so clueless that I wouldn't already have done something with it? And if I do have one sitting around, why is it sitting around? Is that really the kind of lead you'd want to work on? But that's not why I say don't ask vendors for leasing leads. I say don't ask vendors for leasing leads because they're not qualified to define leasing leads. What's the definition of a good lease prospect anyway? To the typical vendor, now I know there are exceptions, but for the most part this is true. To the typical vendor, a leasing lead is a prospect who can't afford to buy. Is that your definition? It's not mine. My definition of a good lease prospect is someone who could easily afford to buy but chooses not to. That can be a huge difference. When you're planning your marketing strategy and think of vendor leads, remember what I said a few minutes ago. Traditional vendor strategies all have the same goal, to get the vendor to call with a lead. And that very goal is, in turn, their weakness. The vendor's idea of a good leasing lead may not be what your idea of a good leasing lead is at all. The fact is, when you're working the vendor's leads, you're not working the vendor's working you. Let's look at what a better, more effective vendor-oriented marketing strategy would focus on. And I'll share with you a couple of tactics that could make it work. It's my hope that you'll take these ideas and carry them even further than I can describe here, using the basics of them to develop more creative and more effective ways to get the most from your vendor relationships. Ideally, your vendor plan should let you identify your own prospects, let you pick and choose the credits you want to work on without alienating your vendors. Should make any vendor you choose eager to work with you, regardless of what other leasing plans they have available. And do so without you having to cut your rates or pay out points. You can accomplish all of that and do so easily with one shift in how you look at your job. Instead of looking to your vendors to be the source of your prospects, take responsibility for identifying your own prospects and then use your vendors as an avenue for getting in the door with them and for providing a leasable solution you can make a presentation on. It's easier than you think, far more productive, and infinitely more valuable to your vendors. Here are just 2 ideas. Everyone you and your vendor could work effectively on together can be identified as in one or the other of 2 groups. Prospects your vendor wants to close and prospects your vendor wants to see. Let's start with prospects your vendor wants to close first. The key here is to be careful what you ask for, because you might get it. As we saw just a little while ago, asking a vendor for leasing leads can be problematic because what you're likely to get are prospects that, if workable at all, could be unnecessarily difficult to get approved and booked. So you simply need to change what you ask for. If vendors aren't qualified to identify good leasing leads, ask them something they are qualified to answer, from which you then can infer whether or not the prospect's a good leasing lead before you put your time in. Now, the vendor is qualified to identify good using leads. Now, as an equipment leasing salesperson, you know that if a prospect understands that using equipment, not owning it, is what benefits him, he's very likely to be turned into a good leasing lead for you. So here's an example that can get you good leasing leads from a vendor every time. Start by helping the vendor to help you. I believe that most vendors do want to help you, and they don't knowingly want to waste your time. When you call a vendor and ask for the best leasing lead, though, think about it. You've put the whole world in front of him and asked him to pick out the one best prospect for you to spend your time on. That's way too much pressure and responsibility. The first thing you need to do then is what I call shrinking the world. Ask the vendor, of the last 5 presentations you made, you can use 3, 7, 10, or whatever is appropriate to the kind of vendor you're working with. The point is to focus the vendor on a manageable number that are fresh in his memory. Of the last 5 presentations you made that haven't closed yet, which one are you most surprised didn't close? See, you've shrunk the world down to 5 specific prospects, none of whom have made a leasing or cash decision yet, and most importantly, asked him a question he's qualified to answer. Even more importantly, the answer to this question is the best prospect he's got, the one he did a spot-on presentation for, the one he has the most use for the equipment, and the one that he knows can afford it. The reason I like this question is that the vendors are never surprised they didn't close the marginal prospects. They're never surprised they didn't close the one they doubted could afford it. The one they're surprised at is the one they're sure can afford it. So now ask him why he's surprised they didn't close, and what you'll get is a clear description of how much that prospect will benefit from using the equipment. The vendor knows that benefit, but frequently it hasn't been communicated effectively or justified financially to the prospect. I now know 2 critical things. I know there's a prospect that very likely could afford to buy the equipment, and I understand exactly how using that equipment will benefit that prospect. Pretty potent stuff, don't you agree? And very likely a good leasing prospect. So here's what to ask the vendor now. If I were to talk to that prospect, I don't know, maybe I ran into him in the grocery store or at a party, or we got to talking about how we'd use that equipment, and somehow, and for some reason, he decided to lease it from me, and your sale got closed, would you really care that the money came from me instead of from him? Now, who wouldn't say no to that? See, what I did to make it non-threatening before we even talked about identifying the specific prospect that vendor's thinking about is I asked him a theoretical question so patently absurd he'd have to go along with it. In fact, the more hypothetical or absurd the example, the better, because I'm talking about one of the most treasured things that vendor has, and that's a hot prospect. And I want him to understand and agree with me conceptually before he has to think about actually putting that prospect on the line. So if he does agree that he wouldn't care where the money came from, now I'll say, well, I have no idea if your prospect would even be interested, but let me tell you what I'd ask him if I did run into him, and you tell me if this could in any way jeopardize your sale. Mr. Vendor, here's what I'd ask him. Mr. Prospect, what got your interest about this equipment? I'd ask that first, Mr. Vendor, because that brings back to the front of his mind all the benefits he'd get from using it, and that's what he'll generally describe to me, exactly how he'd benefit from using it. When he does, I'd respond by asking him this. Mr. Prospect, if I could show you how you could have all those benefits, and I'd basically parrot back to him a recap of the benefits he described to me as the reasons he's interested, if I could show you how you could have those and you didn't have to buy a thing, and the federal government would, in effect, subsidize up to 1/3 of the cost, Would it be worth 10 to 15 minutes of your time for me to go over that with you? Mr. Vendor, that's exactly what I'd say to him. And let me tell you what I'd find out as a result. And then you tell me if it would jeopardize your sale or maybe help it. Generally, when I ask that of a prospect, I'll find out one of three things. First, he's not interested because he's already decided to buy it from you. He already knows how he's going to pay for it, and he just hasn't gotten around to telling you yet. And if that's the case, I'll be able to call you and let you know that. Now, wouldn't that be good news? The second is, he is interested, and we sit down and look at some leasing options, and he gives me the go-ahead, and I call you back and tell you I'm sending you a purchase order. Wouldn't that be good news too? The third thing I'm likely to find out is that there's some other fly in the ointment holding up the sale. Maybe he doesn't really understand the equipment, or he's not really the final decision maker, or they're looking at competing proposals or something else. Now, of course, I know that's not good news, but wouldn't it be important and helpful information to you just the same if I found that out? Now, the reason that this has been so successful, and so, of course, why I like it so much, is twofold. It doesn't matter what other leasing programs the vendor's got available, be they broker programs, bank programs, or in-house programs. If I can get him thinking about his prospects in this way, he's thinking of a single good prospect, and whatever else he's got available is either not working or it didn't occur to him to try it. Either way, I'm not threatening to any existing program because we're not talking about giving up anything he's doing. We're talking about trying to find out where he stands on a specific transaction. Secondly, I like it because I get to decide whether or not I even want to call on the prospect. If, when he describes the prospect, my initial questioning brings to his mind, if it doesn't seem like a likely prospect for me, I can skip right past it. I'm not promising to be his leasing program and committing to investing my time trying to get any and every prospect he's got credit approval. We're just talking about one specific open opportunity he's got, and if it sounds good to me, what I might do to help him close it. Let's take a look now at the other group of prospects you and your vendor can work on effectively together. Prospects your vendor wants to see. Now, perhaps like you, I was always taught that our best role was to work with our vendors at the closing end of their transaction, and that belief became commonplace in our industry. In fact, when I started in this business, there were so few leasing sources around that my existence alone was valuable to my vendors. That's just no longer true today. Today, with the number of leasing and other financing sources available to vendors, and with the proliferation and convenience of all the information available on the internet and from other sources, even if I'm still helpful, my existence or the existence of any other single source is far less significant. However, because of all the businesses out there and because of all the information so readily available to your vendor's customers, your vendor faces the same kind of problem and faces a much greater challenge than getting any individual sale closed. Your vendor's greatest challenge is getting in the door. Just ask them. The good news about this is we're uniquely positioned to help them with that, and doing so effectively is one of the most profitable and productive ways to sell equipment leasing. It's profitable because when you become the door opener, when you become the prospecting source for your vendors, you've changed a critical dynamic in the relationship, and you're no longer working on their leads, they're working on yours. Because of that, you now set the pricing. I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of your pricing pressure now comes from the vendor and not from the lessee. Even most of what does come from the lessee is introduced by the vendor because of the way the price is presented. When it's your prospect, when you're part of the sale from the very beginning, you can both set the pricing and control how it's presented. When you can do that, you'll find your transactions can be more profitable for you. It's productive too. It's productive because when you're doing the prospecting, you choose the classes of customers you want to work on. Your vendor's still free to sell to anyone he wants to, but you're only committing to work on the programs where you've determined in advance that you've got a high chance of approval. When you're working with a vendor and you can see your approval rates go up and your pricing pressure go down, you've got an effective vendor strategy. So what am I talking about here? Am I talking about direct marketing to end user lessees? Well, yes and no. What I mean is yes, but not in the traditional sense. See, most direct lessee marketing strategies struggle because the approach and presentation is not married to a concurrent presentation of a specific benefit or benefits of whatever might be leased. Trying to sell equipment leasing as a concept when the prospect does not have specific usage benefits to tie the concept to is, well, boring, to put it bluntly. Nobody's interested in equipment leasing. What they're interested in is leasing a specific item from which they can see specific and measurable usage benefits. The objective then is to find a way to always present leasing attached to such benefits. That's where we need our vendors, and that's where we can be invaluable to them. So basically, you need to talk to people who have a specific problem or need they'd like solved by a specific piece or pieces of equipment, whether or not they even realize it themselves yet. How do you identify them? You don't. Your vendor does that for you. Your vendor has all kinds of prospecting lists they've either put together themselves or gotten from their manufacturers. They know who needs their equipment. They just don't always know how to get that door open. See, when they start working those lists, "Hi, I'm XYZ vendor," what do you suppose they hear most frequently? "I'm not in the market for XYZ equipment today." Their primary sales training comes from their manufacturers too. Because their manufacturers aren't as much interested in training them to sell equipment as they are in training them to sell XYZ equipment, their training tends to be technically focused. XYZ equipment uses higher grade alloys or has an ISO certified inspection process. Their sales approaches to a very large extent are built from this kind of training and frankly aren't always very effective. Even when it does generate interest, and generally with someone who's already shopping, it focuses on features and therefore results in tremendous price pressure right from the outset. This is the real challenge your vendors face, the problem that if you solve for them, you become beyond valuable. It's also the problem that if you solve for them, you solve most of the problems you have with them. The ways this could be done are so varied that it would be impossible to adequately cover them in a program of this length. So we'll just look at one example for right now. Make it clear to your vendors that you're not going to depend on them for handouts and will be taking responsibility for finding your own prospects. Tell them candidly what you can and can't do well. Because you're not the vendor and don't therefore get the knee-jerk reactions from prospects that they get, you can engage prospects, focus them on the problems they need solved, and eliminate most money objections in advance and do it very well. What you're not qualified to do is select and demonstrate equipment. Get their agreement that your interests are the same, though. To identify someone who needs new equipment and get them to say yes to it. Now ask them this. What 3 things, Mr. Vendor, if you knew about a prospect, would tell you right away they were a good prospect for you and what you could sell to them? Here's why I like this question. Well, I guess I should say, here's why this question works. The reason I like it is because it does work. It's incredibly effective. But the reason why it works is because when a vendor answers that question, he won't be telling you about metal alloys or manufacturing processes. He'll always answer that by describing the actual customer problems that the equipment solves. It never fails. It's almost funny because they do know that stuff. They're just not that good at using it. We can be. Now you have a way to approach a given list of prospects by talking about specific problems you know they have and are likely to want solved. All you have to do is focus them on that. And believe me, they're very, very interested because your understanding of their problems makes you someone they want to talk to. When you find someone who is interested, they'll want to know what it costs to solve the problem, and you simply say, if I could show you a way to solve that problem without you having to buy anything, and the federal government would, in effect, subsidize up to 1/3 of the cost, would you want to look at that? Then offer them a free, no-obligation cost analysis. Tell them this. In order to make their cost analysis specific and meaningful to their needs and their business, you're going to ask an expert in that equipment to come by and evaluate exactly what it will take to solve the problems, and then you'll get back to them quickly with the numbers they need. The expert, of course, is the vendor. You've just gotten a door open more effectively than he could have done himself, and set up an opportunity for a demonstration and a quote. Now here's the good part. Because you got the door open, it's your prospect, and you'll determine how it's followed up. Your only stipulation to the vendor is that once he demos and specs out a solution, he doesn't quote any pricing except to you. After all, the promise you made to the prospect that got the vendor in for a demo is that you would provide them a cost analysis, and so you need the numbers in order to put that together. Now the pricing is presented clearly attached to the problem-solving benefits the customer wants, and with a lease quote presented from the very beginning. And remember, you're only doing this on classes of prospects you've pre-qualified as likely to be approvable. One last thing on this. Some of you are wondering, where do I get lists of prospects like this to work on? Your vendor will provide them. Once your vendor accepts that your interests are the same, and that you're going out prospecting for someone anyway, whether that's by phone or mail or internet or in person, it becomes in your vendor's best interest for you to be prospecting his list rather than someone else's. Put it this way. After asking him what 3 things would tell him who's a good prospect, get his agreement that the sooner you get someone talking, the better it is for both of you. He'll agree to that. Then ask, if you were me, where would you start? That'll get him thinking about prospect lists he's got. Wouldn't it if it was you? There are so many ways to incorporate this kind of thinking into more effective prospecting and vendor partnerships. The only limitation is your imagination, but the key is to begin to visualize how your role could be different and more effective for both you and your vendor. Will every vendor respond well to these kinds of approaches? No. Only the best salespeople among them will. Just as it takes imagination for you to break out of the traditional ways of doing things so that you can sell more effectively, it takes imagination on the part of your vendor too. That's part of why you should be trying to do so. An effective vendor strategy should attract the better quality salespeople and run off the ones that would abuse your time. They're for other non-NAELB brokers to work with. I want to close by talking about this for just a minute, and then I'm going to tell you how you can know for sure whether or not you should be trying to build these kinds of ideas into your vendor marketing plans. Most small brokers can dramatically increase the effectiveness of their vendor relationships and dramatically cut the time they waste on unsold or undoable transactions if they would understand and embrace the Pareto principle. You may know it as the 80-20 rule. Pareto observed that in any given enterprise, the majority of the results actually came from a relatively small minority of the efforts. Management consultants in the 40s referred to it as the critical few and the useless many. Most experienced sales managers have seen it in action in their own sales forces. If that is true, and it's been my personal observation over many years that it is, then most small brokers would be better, more effectively served by thinking in terms of vendor sales reps rather than thinking of vendor companies and vendor programs. When you offer a vendor program to a company, you are in effect committing to work on whatever any of their salespeople bring you to work on. If 80% of their sales force is responsible for only 20% of the results, you're setting yourself up for a lot of wasted time and effort. Work instead to identify that 20% of the salespeople who are producing most of the results and develop personal relationships with them. They're the high achievers, and they have 2 things in common that can improve your effectiveness. The first is, high achievers don't like to waste time, and they know that a few dollars one way or the other rarely makes a difference in their sales. They're much more likely to be interested in your promptness and professionalism than they are in your rates. That's not true of the rest of the sales force. Average salespeople look for someone to blame. Your rates are too high. High-achieving salespeople look for someone who can help. The second is that high achievers generally got to be high achievers by being different than the rest of the sales force. You don't get better results than everyone else by doing what everyone else is doing. They're more likely to be open and responsive to creative new ways of extending your sales relationship. It doesn't usually matter to them either what kinds of official programs they have in place. If they think working with you will help them personally, they'll figure out a way around the company program. And because they're producing, their managers will let them do it too. Think in terms of people, not companies. 10 good salespeople who are in the top 20% of their respective companies could produce more business more effectively for you than twice that number of company programs. Now, I promised to tell you how to know for sure if using some of these ideas would be right for you. It's simple, and anyone that knows me already knows what I'm going to say. Just ask yourself this one simple question. Would you rather sell this way, or would you rather compete against someone who does? You can be more valuable to your vendors, and that can make them more valuable to you. Thanks for watching. I'm Gerry Egan, and this has been a presentation of the NAELB's Distance Learning Program.